Billy Royal at the home of Wanda Royal in Wade, North Carolina, January the 30th, 2012.
This is Billy Royal from Salemburg talking about young happenings in Salemburg. When life was slow and easy back when I was growing up, kids could do most anything they wanted. Parents didn't worry about them. So one of the things I did one summer when I was about 14, 15, we had a character that lived at Salemburg by the name of Bevo Parker. Bevo was an only child. He was a sometimes alcohol abuser, never tied his shoes, took a bath once a week, whether he needed it or not. And he drove a produce truck. And at least for many years he would take produce, including sweet potatoes or corn or whatever was being produced, to New York City on regular trips. So I rode with him once, went up to New York. At that time it was during the early World War II, probably 1940 would be my guess, 39 or 40, when the war was breaking out. And my brother Emily was working in Baltimore at the Martin aircraft factory. So I decided to take a trip to see him, and so I went with Bevo on his produce to New York City. So we drove all the way to New York. I'd never been there before. And we got there to the produce market in the middle of the night, as with hundreds of other trucks. And while I got there, I had to go to the bathroom. Had eaten something on the way. So I got out of the truck and found a bathroom, which was terrible. And when I came out of the bathroom, I couldn't find Bevo. He had moved on. So I started looking, lots of people, lots of trucks, and I found a black policeman. I had never seen a black policeman before. We didn't have those in North Carolina. And I talked to him, and he asked me what we were carrying, and I told him. And he told me about where he thought this truck would be, because that's where they would be unloading sweet potatoes. So I went there, and Bevo was asleep in the truck. He wasn't bothered at all about that I was missing. And anyway, we unloaded the produce, and the next day we headed back south. We went to Philadelphia. They were having the All-Star baseball game in Philadelphia that day, which and all we had to do was go to the gate and buy a ticket. It wasn't like it is these days. And we went and bought a ticket, and I recall Mel Ott playing, and the manager for the Philadelphia team was a little small guy whose son has recently been a senator from Florida, and he was a professorial type fellow, small guy, but he was manager of the Philadelphia team and may have been the owner for many years. We walked around Philadelphia a bit, and of course my first visit there, and I'm not sure Bevo had ever been there, and we saw the historic district. We were walking down the street near there, and Bevo grabbed me and says, "Come on," started running. And so I went with him and wondering what was up. We went down a little alley, and Bevo said he just saw a man up there that he owed some money to, and he didn't want the man to see him. So, but anyway, that was our very educational trip to Philadelphia. We then started driving south. We got near Baltimore, And Bevo didn't want to drive through Baltimore, so we stopped at a truck stop where the highways met and diverged. And Bevo talked with some people, and he found me a ride into Philadelphia with another truck driver. Of course, I didn't know the guy, and the guy didn't know me. And so I got in this other truck and went on to Baltimore, and Bevo got back in his truck and went the other way. We got into Baltimore about daylight, and the guy stopped and let me out at a service station. And I called my brother, Emily, who was living and working there at the Glenn L. Martin aircraft factory, and he came and picked me up. Salemburg had a group of people working there, and they had rented a three-story house, kind of a townhouse, and they had 2 or 3 girls from Salemburg working, living and working there. Idell Warren, a Norton girl, and another girl, and the girls were on the top story of this house. The men occupied the second floor, and that included Emily, Norton, Porter, James A. Porter, and Doc Porter, and maybe someone else. And the first floor was their kitchen and day room. So they alternated cooking and just kind of had a little commune there for several months as a Salemburg group. So the women were the first workers from Salemburg in the war effort in World War II. So later, one of the guys, they had a habit of these guys, they would buy a car in Baltimore and drive it to North Carolina, because you couldn't buy automobiles back then hardly, and they'd drive it to Salemburg, and then they'd sell it when they got there and make a few dollars profit and get them a ride back to North Carolina. That was one of the stories when, and you know, back then our parents didn't worry about us, and as evidence about they thought everybody was safe, and generally they were. Another occasion that happened when I was young, they were having a preaching service, revival at the Salemburg Baptist Church. And I was going to go one night, but either I was late or wasn't dressed, so I went up in the balcony for the service. And during the process, I went to sleep. And apparently the service was over and they cut the lights out and everybody went home. And later that night, the fact that I hadn't got back home, the people became perturbed, and so they got out, started searching for me. And family was going everywhere and so forth. And I was asleep in the balcony on one of the benches there. And all of a sudden I was awakened by Uncle Anderson. He had come up and found me. And I recall waking up and seeing Uncle Anderson and saying hello or something of that nature. And I saw that it was dark and generally the lights were out, and it was nighttime and nobody else was at the church. And I got up and ran home and jumped in bed. So that was an interesting story. Okay. Another story about Bevo, who both parents had died, and he lived in their house on Front Street, Main Street in Salemburg. And generally in the winter he didn't have any heat, and he'd wear everything he had to try to stay warm. And sometimes he would drink too much, and so one night Donnie got called to go see him one night or one day. Donnie generally didn't like people that drank, but he went to see Bevo, and he got to the house, and somehow Bevo had gotten under the bed, and the bed had fallen in on him. And Donnie had to help get the bed off and pull him out from under the bed and take care of him. So he was quite a character. He came to the barber shop, had a shower, and often farm people as well as workers, they didn't have showers at home or running water, and they would come in on Saturday and take a shower. Cost them 15 cents. Take a shower with one towel given to them, and they would get a haircut if they needed one. But Donnie was a doctor, and he took care of everybody in Salemburg, in the whole district. He had a waiting room, and the waiting room functioned so that the last person that came in would be at the end of the line, or if they were sitting there, and whoever was next would be seen next. The waiting room was not segregated as most waiting rooms at doctor's offices and most places were segregated in those days, except Donnie's office was never segregated. So whoever came in, whether it's black or white or Indian, since we had Indians around, Native Americans, they would come in and take their turn, and Donnie would see them. He didn't keep records except in his head. He had the greatest memory of anybody I've ever known. And since he knew most of the people and their family, he had some concept of what was wrong with them or their family illnesses. And he would see them and take their blood pressure and check them over, and his nurse or assistant would do a urinalysis and take their temperature and whatever, and Donnie would see them and prescribe whatever medication. Sometimes he gave them the medication from his office, and sometimes he owned the drugstore there. That Mr. Creech was a pharmacist. They would go down there and get their medication. And the only entrant that Donnie would make was into his ledger, would give the date, the name of the person, may have a comment about what was wrong with them and how much he charged them. And the fee was often 50 cents. If they got medicine, it would be another 50 cents. And a lot of time people charged it. And if they were farmers, they'd come in once a year and pay up. And that was the only thing. If his fee for delivering babies was $15 and carrying the woman through labor and going to the house and delivering the baby. And if it was twins, it would be $5 more. I still have his records the ledgers that he had. Once the Internal Revenue was going to investigate them, and he said fine. He gave them all their books, and they came back and couldn't find anything wrong. Somebody threatened to sue him for something once, and Donnie says, okay, you go ahead and sue them, and I'll help you, and if you get anything, we'll split it. So he wasn't concerned about that. He would make house calls. His general method of operation was that he would walk to the office in the morning after he had breakfast, generally beginning about 8:30 or 9 o'clock, and he'd see patients as long as there was anybody to be seen. And sometimes that went to 1 o'clock, but generally they would stop, and then he'd walk home, have lunch that Dorothy would have for him, and sometimes he'd take a little nap, and then he'd start in his car and start making house calls. He made house calls over about 4 counties, especially during World War II, when there were not many doctors around. And if that included staying with a person all night, a woman all night, to deliver a baby, he'd do that. Then he'd stay until he'd made all house calls, then he'd come back home. When I was in Salemburg after I finished college and people went to bed pretty early at night, the only house in town that in which anybody stayed up late was Donnie's house, and Dorothy would stay up writing letters or doing something. till he came home or until later, so I would go over and sit with her and pass the time of the evening waiting for Donnie to come home. Later on, I would go with him occasionally when he made rounds. They didn't have a hospital in Salemburg until the early 1950s. So if somebody had to go to the hospital, they'd have to go to Fayetteville, which was the closest hospital. There was not one in Clinton. And if they didn't have transportation, Donnie would take them in his car. But anyway, if I went with him and he was delivering a baby, or later if he went to the hospital in Clinton when they had one, I couldn't stay awake as long as he could, and I'd go to sleep and wait for him to finish, and then we'd go back to Salemburg. He had one occasion in which a person was intoxicated. A lot of people in Salemburg drank a lot. The use of alcohol was very prevalent. And this person was a farmer, came to town, and his mother lived in town, and he was intoxicated, and he went to her house, and she wouldn't let him in, so he ran his hand through the glass door and cut the artery in his arm, and the people brought him back down to Donnie's office. Well, Donnie's office had a side door with an open lot next to it, and they put the guy on the ground there, and Donnie would come out of his office to take care of the guy, to sew up his arm and so forth. And all the kids would come and stand around and watch and what was going on. And the guy told Donnie, he said, "Let me die, let me die." And Donnie looked at him and said, "Damn it, if you don't shut up, I'm going to let you die." And that was the end of that episode anyway. My father had a general store in Salemburg. He worked at the shipyard in Portsmouth, Virginia during World War I, and then came back to Salemburg and opened a soda shop and little store, and that grew. And when we were kids, it was a general store, and that meant it had groceries, had what we called dry goods, which meant you had clothing, overalls, pants, women's clothing of all types, sewing equipment, and gradually we added some hardware to that. So all of us kids grew up working at the store. And my father would open the store at about 6 o'clock in the morning during the summer. He would go to the store and open, and then we kids, when we got big enough, we would go to the store and relieve him, and he'd come back to the house and have breakfast and then go back to the store. And so we would swap off like that. The stores then, you would go, a person would come in the store and you had, people didn't wait on themselves. You had tables with all the dry goods and so forth, but then you had shelves, and the people would come in and tell you what they wanted, and you'd go get that and bring it back and forth and back and forth. Also, we had the only meat market in town, so we sold fresh meat and pork, and had fish, and we had an ice house that people didn't have refrigeration. They would come in and buy a piece of ice, and particularly on the weekends, and take it home for the iced tea and so forth. And on Sunday after church, because people wouldn't get enough ice, so they'd come in and buy what they call their fresh. That means their fresh meat or fish, and then they'd go home and cook that for Sunday dinner. We stayed open at night, generally during the summer to 8 o'clock. As long as anybody was buying anything, our store would stay open. On Saturday night, Saturday was a big day in Salemburg. Salemburg was a big traffic town. We had I had three uncles that had stores there. Uncle Ab, Uncle Ivy, and Uncle Sam all had stores, and there were two or three other stores. There was one or two filling stations. We sold gas at our store, had a pump out front with a big glass top, and we'd pump gas. We also had beside the store a oil rack. People would drive their car up on it, and we'd change the oil in their car, or they would change it. And so that was so you had something of everything in the store. During my early years, the store would be broken into occasionally. It was on at least two occasions. And once the people came out and intercepted the robbers, and they took a gun and they shot at each other, and so we had so the marks of that shooting were there for many years, but nobody was hit. So my dad bought a bulldog, and we'd put that in the store at night to try to keep the robbers from coming in. On one occasion, the bulldog would attack anybody, so it was kept mean, so it would attack people. So we had it in our yard at our home with a big fence around it, and sometimes it would just be on a chain. And once when friend Ollie Royal McKenzie was at the house, he saw something out there, and he went by the bulldog, and without paying attention, and the bulldog attacked him and bit him in the stomach, so he had to get the vaccinations for tetanus, which were very painful in those days. On Saturday night, we'd stay open, which was the big time in town. We'd stay open until 12 o'clock, and then we'd close and clean up the meat market and whatever. Herman Boykin at that time ran a little cafe across the street. And so after he closed on Saturday night and we closed, or about 12 o'clock, he had a big car. He'd take a carload of people to Clemson to the movies. They'd have movies that would start at 12 o'clock at night. And so as many, usually young boys, would pile into his car, and you'd go to Clemson to the movie beginning at 12 or 1 o'clock on Saturday night. Herman was, before he had the cafe there, he ran a little service station out in the country about 2 miles from Salemburg, and he had a boxing ring next to his station. And in the summer, there were people that would go around from town to town that would box, and they'd take on anybody in the neighborhood that wanted to box them. And the winner would get a certain amount of money. So Herman had a little boxing ring next to his station out near Salemburg that he did that. Before he was in the, had the cafe, Clinty White, Frank White was her husband. She had a little hot dog and hamburger stand there. These were all little wooden structures downtown. And so she ran that for several years till she and her family moved to Clemson. Her son was Willie Frank White. He and I were good friends and same age when we were in school.
Okay.
During our childhood, there wasn't such a thing as TV or anything. We did have radio, and we had a big radio in our store that we kept playing, and particularly during the national boxing matches like Joe Louis and so forth, a lot of people didn't have radios, and so it was sitting at the back of our store next to a side door, and we would turn it wide open, and people would come and stand outside of the store to listen to the boxing match. And that was kind of recreation. The other things that went on in terms of recreation was there were always medicine men that came through town during the summer, and they would set up a shop on a vacant lot back of our store and sell things and have little comedy programs and whatever. In addition to that, we would have silent movies in the summertime. Some company would come through and they'd have fix up a sheet on a rack in the middle of the street in front of the stores, and traffic would be blocked off. This was generally on a Wednesday night, and people would come on their wagons or drive or bring chairs and sit and watch a silent movie, which was put on the street. And if people were driving through town, they'd have to go around the block, and there were not any specific regulations. At another time, Uncle Sam did silent movies next to his store, which was around the next block from us, and they would have somebody playing the piano or some music while that silent movie was going on. Our store was only a short block from where we lived, so our going from home to the store was usually very quick. We would, while we went to school, they didn't have schools didn't have lunchrooms, so most people were brought in by buses from the country to the school, but all the town kids would go home for lunch. So we would go home for lunch, and generally lunch was a long time, and we'd spend some time in the store before we went back to school in the afternoon. Our school we had school fires, and our primary school got burned, and they petitioned the gymnasium to make classrooms in it. But the petitions went up about 8 or 10 feet, and then it was open above that, and there would be birds flying around all day in the gymnasium, and you could generally hear a little noise from the other classrooms. The classroom I was in that particular year was taught by my cousin, Mamie Howard, who actually lived next door to us. I was in the 7th grade, and it was on the corner, the room I was in, and there was a door from the classroom leading to the outside. And Mamie would be teaching, and when she would turn her back, specifically one of the boys that sat up near the door would run out the door when she couldn't see him, and he'd stay gone a while, and then he'd peek back in the door, and when she wasn't looking, he'd run back into the room. I remember she read, during that year, she read a book to us, a chapter at the time, which is the only time I can remember him when they were doing that, and the book was called Dr. Dolittle, and it's been a famous children's book and a movie and so forth. There was not much literary activity at the school. There were no courses that had any laboratories in it. When I was in high school, everybody had gone to the war, and there were not but 2 or 3 teachers, and they had not had any formal training in teaching science courses, and so we didn't get a lot of education. There was no language course taught. I never recall writing a theme or an essay about anything or having any assigned tasks, so we didn't get much of an education back then. One of the things that we did during our family was we became the agents for the Raleigh paper, the News and Observer. This was started by my oldest brother, Remy Jr., and when one would leave home, the next one in step would take it over, and we would collect money for the News and Observer from people. They would get it by the week, either pick it up at our store, or sometimes they had it delivered in their mail. And on Sunday, we would get the paper and people would pick it up from there. And we would take the newspaper up to Pineland and EMI, the local college and schools, and we would go through the dormitory and sell the newspaper to students there that wanted to buy a newspaper. We did that for many years. We were the newspaper people, and finally when either Joe or myself quit that, we turned it over to some other person that did that. There was, say, not a lot of activity going on in terms of recreation, and people were rather made up stories and whatever. And we had the community of Hamburg, which was near us, was a rural area in which people previously had been a lot of drinking and fighting, but they were interesting people, and in fact all the royals came from Hamburg. And on one Saturday, one of our acquaintances came in the store and said, from Hamburg, and said he had just gotten a call from his son, about his son in Fayetteville, that he had been killed, and he was going up to see about him. So a few hours later he came back in the store, and he had a smile on his face and was kind of laughing, and we wondered what was going on. And two of his sons had a reputation of drinking a lot and so forth. And he said, you know, that crazy thing, said he called home and told us and had somebody to tell us that he had been killed. He just wanted to scare his mother up. Said, I went up there and there wasn't a thing wrong with him. And, you know, he wasn't even mad about it. He was just laughing about it. The lack of activity made people be innovative about what they did, and so one of our cousins who lived next door to us was named Evander Howard, and during World War II and earlier than that, there wasn't much activity, and so on Halloween or Christmas, one of the sports of some of the guys was to take a stick of dynamite and light it and see who would hold it in their hand the longest they could before they tossed it away. And Evander didn't toss his away quick enough, and it blew off two of his fingers, and after that he was always called Nub, was his nickname. Willie Frank and White and I, we didn't have parties back in those days, so occasionally someone would have a party, and Willie Frank and I went to a party in the country one night, and they started a fight in the house. And so somebody said someone had a knife or a gun or something, and Willie Frank and I went out the windows, and we happened to have a car at that time, and got in our car and left before anything happened. Generally, you couldn't travel much in World War II because the only people that could get gas, you had to have a legitimate business. Farmers could get a certain amount of gas. They had gas stamps. And since a lot of people were farmers, some of the farm boys would get a little gas, and we'd go dating or something on Saturday night. But most of the time you couldn't get gas to go. You also had food stamps to get certain kinds of food with. And so we would have to get gas stamps and then be able to go and travel that way. People stayed pretty close to home in those days. Actually, I only recall going to one birthday party during my whole high school career. We did not have a prom or any parties at graduation or any kind of social activities related to that. We only went to 11 years in school then. And then when they stopped that, they went 1 year without any graduation class because they went to the 12th grade. Highland School and Edwards Military Institute were in full swing during my early years and during all of my time in Salemburg. So the military guys were marching all the time, marching through town. And some of the town boys would go to school there and participate in the parades. And I took clarinet and learned to play a clarinet, and I could join the marching band at the military school. The girls were there, and during World War II, they taught the girls to march, and they dressed in uniforms, and they also learned to shoot rifles during the World War II. We were close to Fort Bragg, and during World War II, the Army maneuvers would come through and take part in Salemburg, and the airplanes would come over there with regularity. And before the invasion of Europe, the planes would come over that would be pulling 2 gliders behind them in practice for when they ultimately landed and went over and invaded Europe. So we were very military oriented down there. They had a May Day parade at the military school, and it was a big day. They had competition among all the cadets, and the girls were all dressed up. And so that was a big day in Salemburg. It was full of people back those days.